Hey everyone, it's 10 Types, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make a counter meta deck. Pretty much all the steps you need to go through to make it. And honestly, part of the reason I'm making this video is because I want a deck to play right now. And I'm just going to be showing off how to make it. And I'll probably show off I'll have the list at the end of the video because we'll have made it by that point. And then I'll probably show it off playing with it in another video. Might make some tweaks after this, but pretty much the first important thing is understanding what a counter meta deck is. It's pretty much a deck that its main goal is to beat all the other decks. And you might be thinking, well, that's like the goal of every deck, but this deck isn't necessarily trying to be a strong deck with inherently good damage output and health and stuff. It's just trying to beat other decks, such as like the top decks. And it can be really hard to make, but if you get a good counter meta deck, and you're able to play it well, it can do really well. And I'm going to be showing you how to make a deck like that. Keep in mind though that counter meta decks usually only beat the best decks. If you're against a deck that's not one of those, it's just going to probably lose. But if it's against one of the decks you're planning for, it'll just win. Generally, counter meta decks aren't entirely that way. So if you're against a deck that you're not necessarily expecting to see, if you're able to pilot it well, you'll be able to beat some of those matchups. But generally, it's just made to beat a few top decks. And the first step, there's a few different important ways you can start out. The one way, though, that I'd recommend is identifying what you need to beat in the meta. And so I'd take a look at play.limitlesstcg.com and then look at the decks section. This shows off everything that's being played. It shows off the meta and what's good. Pretty much you want to look at maybe all the decks that make up 5% or more of the meta, have a share of 5% more. Keep in mind, though, you get into an interesting problem here. Certain decks are broken up, so you see that there are no Arceus decks that are 5% of the meta or more. It cuts off right here between Hisuian, Gudra, and Regis, but then there are a bunch of Arceus decks down here, like Inteleon, Flying Pikachu, Giratina, which are all very good decks, Giratina and Aggron, and so you probably want to account for Arceus, but you don't necessarily need to account for all of these different decks here. You want to account for as many as you can, though. You want to cover as much of the meta as you can, and so I'm going to be looking at each of the different lists and figuring out how to beat them. But also one thing you want to figure out is what engine you want. Right now there's a few different engines. There's the Lost Zone engine, the Barrel engine, the Inteleon engine, and then certain decks don't really play much of an engine at all. For a counter meta deck, you certainly want an engine. Sometimes people like to go without an engine, and usually those decks don't work because they have a lot of moving pieces and you're never able to hit what you want. So you're going to go with probably the strongest engine, and so probably not the Barrel engine. You want an engine that can pick out the right piece at the right time. So you could go with Inteleon. Inteleon engine is a lot of space, though. And you also want energy acceleration, so that would probably be the Lost Zone engine. And this is the same engine that the Giratina V-Star list uses. And so we're going to probably use this as a template. So I'm probably just going to copy this list here. You see it has the comfy closed experiment and all-important Mirage Gate, which can accelerate energy, which is super important because you want to have access to as many attackers as possible. And sometimes your attackers won't be one energy, so you want to be able to accelerate to them. So I'm going to go into PTCGO here and just import the deck. And I don't own all these cards, but it doesn't really matter. I'll probably clean the deck list up at some point, but I could do that at the end, and you just have a general idea. Actually decided to clean up the deck list there just to make it look a bit nicer. And now we can go ahead, look at this list, and remove the stuff that we don't need in our counter meta deck. In this case, it's the main attacker. So we see this 3-2 Giratina line. Just take that out of the list. That's not really important right now. And also, you will be wanting to change the energy counts, and specifically the energy types. But for now, we'll just leave it as a placeholder 14 energy. Honestly, a lot of this will probably stay the same, but you want to have an idea of how much energy to use. I predict our attackers won't take as much energy as Giratina, which is like 2 or 3 to do its big attacks, but just keeping that in mind, that you may want to reduce the energy, you might want to cut into some other cards, but be very careful when cutting into other cards. Don't try to take out big parts of the engine to fit in more attackers and techs, because you're just going to end up with a deck that doesn't work. So I'll save this template as the counter template, and this will be what we go and refer back to for making our deck. So now we're going to look at the meta, and I have a Google document here to keep track of the different decks that we want to beat, how to beat them. Generally, I'd probably write this out on a sheet of paper, but that's kind of hard to track. So I'm just going to look here, and we determined we got the engine already, so we just need to figure out what we're going to fit in there. Keep in mind, right now we only have 5 spots open for like decks, and so we'll probably need to make a few more, but probably not more than 7. I have made my own version of this deck, and honestly, the counter meta deck is going to look a lot like this Lost Zone box with a spoiler, where you have these different techs against certain matchups, but you want to understand why each card's in there, and also be able to replicate this yourself in new metas. So let's look at the different top decks, and the easiest deck to look at here is Palkia and Inteleon, and this deck is pretty, nothing crazy here. But the first thing you want to look at when trying to beat a certain deck, if it's a multi-prize deck, you want to look at its weakness of the main attacker. And luckily, it's super simple with this deck. We got to go to lightning weakness, and so we want to have a lightning Pokemon to be able to one-shot it. Ideally, it's a basic. Ideally, it's a single prizer. And so right now in the current standard format, there are a few options. So I'll go and look at those to beat Palkia. They're all lightning Pokemon, so I'm just going to do lightning. And there's a few. I misspelled that. Raikou V is quite good with this ability to, or its attack, that essentially will just one-shot Palkia. For a lightning and a colorless energy, we'll just do that. There's a few other options. Zeraora from Vivid Voltage is another option. It needs Choice Belt to one-shot Palkia. It does the same thing as a single prizer, though, has Free Retreat, which is kind of cool as well. And then we also have Electrode. And this is, where is it? Electrode. Single Strike Electrode. It also needs a Choice Belt. It's only 1 energy, though, and it's colorless energy, which could be really nice. The big downside here, though, is that it kills itself when it attacks. So that's really bad. And in order to hit it, as I said, you need either a colorless energy and a choice belt or some other damage buff, or you also need a card like single strike energy. And it is a single strike Pokemon, so you can use Obama Snow, and so you can give it more health, but don't use Electrode. It's pretty awkward. Doesn't necessarily give you a good price trade. Raikou and Zeraora are the 2 best options, so I'll write those 2 down now. For Palkia. And so these are our tech options. Don't accidentally pasted the list there. And so I'll note those down as the options for now. I think I know which one I want, but you can decide for yourself. So that's pretty simple because it's weakness. It just tells us pretty much exactly on the card what you want to do to counter it. And you can also look at the deck as a whole. You can see, can I counter the Inteleon engine? You can do that with something like Jolteon with Memory Capsule, which shuts down the abilities, or Galarian Wheezing or something. But those are all either kind of awkward or won't completely stop the deck. So in the end, honestly, neither of those are worth it, and they're just really clunky. So you could try to do that, maybe if you're using the Barrel Engine, and it stops a bunch of Inteleon, but it's not necessarily worth it to have so many deck slots. If you want to put a 2/2 Jolteon line with 2 Memory Capsule, which is relatively sufficient at stopping this deck, that's 6 deck slots as opposed to those attackers, which are just 1 or 2. Raikou is 1. You do need the energy, but you have colorless energy in your attack costs, so generally your energy can be whatever. It's not too big of a deal. You want attackers that work well with others, though, so only 1 lightning and a colorless, easy to accelerate with Mirage Gate, which is 2 different types of basic energy. Not too big of an issue generally, assuming that our other attackers are one type of energy and a colorless type of energy, it's completely fine. So you want to make sure your attackers have good synergy. And then let's look at Mew Genesect next. Or I can look at Kyurem Palkia. Kyurem Palkia doesn't really have an engine. There's a few ways you can go about this. One, you could just say, okay, I'm fine. I can beat Palkia in this deck. And Palkia is a really important part of this deck, so being able to deal with that's fine. And then just ignoring Kyurem VMAX, which is probably what I'll do here. You could also look for metal-type counters to Kyurem VMAX. And I'll look for those. I believe the best is probably Zamazenta V. I'm going to look. I honestly don't remember all the counters. There's the best one here is probably this Zamazenta V, though, which will be able to one-shot Kyurem. Assuming they've taken 2 prizes, it one-shots Kyurem. Otherwise, it could live a turn, and it won't necessarily one-shot unless you have a choice belt. But it's a bit awkward, and I think there's not that much Kyurem, especially on the ladder. So, yeah, you're able to deal with Palkia fine, though, with the Raikou. It's up to you, though. You could consider Zamazenta, but I won't add that to the list. But then let's take a look at Mew VMAX, and this is a different type of deck to counter. Take a look at the image, and yeah, this is a standard list, so there's a few things to take note. Obviously, there is the weakness idea. So, are there any dark Pokemon that can deal with the Mew easily? And there are. I actually don't have it, but there's a really good dark Pokemon. It's Drapion V from the new set, which essentially one-shots Mew VMAX for that big attack cost of 190, which is pretty crazy. But then it's 1 colorless less for each Single Strike, Rapid Strike, and Fusion Strike they have in play. And so now it's important to look back at the Mew VMAX deck and see that they play a ton of Fusion Strike Pokemon, so it'll almost always attack for free and just one-shot Mew. So that's a very fair way to go. Keep in mind here, though, that if they just go in with Meloetta and attack, then you will need something to counter that. Possibly, it's not too big of a deal because it's not something they can attack with all the time. But you want some counter to that. And so you can go in with Cramorant or Sableye, which were originally in this deck. But you can also go in with something like the Raikou V, which is just a good enough attacker. But then the Drapion V is certainly good enough. But there are other counters, and you want to consider the best option. There are some other dark Pokemon, probably most notably. There is Galarian Moltres. There's a few of them. There's this one that accelerates to itself, and this one that it also accelerates to itself, but is a bit more versatile. This one is awkward. It's very clunky and doesn't fit with our deck. If you're playing other engines, it might work, but not with this engine. This Galarian Moltres V could work. It's really good, really self-sustaining. It is 2 dark energy, though, which is more than you like, because that means you can accelerate one with Mirage Gate, one of the dark energies, but you have to attach a dark energy from hand, so it's a bit more costly, and that's not too good. In the context of Drapion V, it's essentially just worse, so we won't be using that. And then there's also Mightyena. One of the big issues of Drapion V and Raikou V is that they are 2 prizes. So you might not get a good prize trade with your opponent because they can just KO your Vs, and so they're getting a bunch of prizes in return. So you could go with Mightyena, which is a stage 1. But we don't play any other stage 1s, which is a really good thing about this deck, but also kind of eliminates the option of stage 1s here. So Drapion V is definitely the best option for countering it. That's more of a specific thing. But another thing to note here is the engine of the deck. So unlike the Inteleon engine, you had to cut out with Jolteon Memory Capsule Eevee. This Genesect V, you can cut out with any ability lock, but you can also cut out with something like Path to the Peak. And that just turns off their abilities. And that it's really good because it just stops their abilities. So you want to look and see how they can bump it, though. They play 2 Lost City and a Lost Vacuum, though, as well as 4 Cramomatic. So there's a decent chance they're escaping Path to the Peak. But that is a counter. That also doesn't just win you the game. You still need to be able to KO their Pokemon. But there's another thing, a win condition that you could access, and that's removing their energy. You can do that with any deck, but notably, and this is really important to notice in any meta, and that's that they play all special energy. In the current meta, you can wall it off with something like Duraludon, Oh, we're searching dark Pokemon. Let's search all the Pokemon. Duraludon. VMAX, which walls off special energy. That's a good enough option. There's usually special energy walls in most formats, but Mew does have an attack on the VMAX that allows it to hit through effects, that max miracle attack. So you don't want to do that option, probably. You can, however, go in with a really good counter in Yveltal, which has this Cry of Destruction attack, which discards special energy, but your opponent can play around it, especially with double turbo energy and Elisa's Sparkle, so that they only have a few energy on the board and can get around the Yveltal. If you do Path to the Peak and Yveltal, you might be able to trap them that way, but playing maybe 2 Yveltals and 4 Path, maybe just 2 Path and 1 Yveltal, way more than just this 1 Drapion V. Possibly more effective, but way more spots. And we only had those like 5 spots to work with, as I was saying. Maybe some more if we cut out some stuff. But it's really awkward to find all the right stuff. So we want to go with the easiest attacker. So we're going to go with Drapion V to counter Mew. And that wasn't too hard either. But now we're going to look at Giratina V-Star. And you can see these are kind of the big 3/4 decks here. There are some other important ones that we'll get to. And so Giratina is really hard to counter. This is the list we're just looking at that we copied to make our own engine. But it's really important here to see how to counter this. And also, in doing so, we will see what the counters to our own deck are and what possible ways of defeating that we can use. So, notably, we see Giratina V-Star. So we'll look at its weakness, and it doesn't have a weakness. So you may be thinking, what am I supposed to do here? There's nothing that can just one-shot it, and that's true. So you're not gonna try to one-shot them. If you try to one-shot everything as the counter, it's not gonna work because not all Pokemon can be one-shotted, and something like Hisuian Gudra will never be one-shotted, and Duraludon and VMAX will never be one-shotted. So you can't go that route here. So instead, you have to look at some other options. One option that some people take is just ignore it, and they are like, I'm just going to hope I don't see this deck, and if I see it, I lose, or I need to do some fancy stuff where I do little bits of damage with my other attackers. Like, maybe I'll hit into them with Drapion, and I'll hit into them with Raikou, and I'll hit into them with Cramorant, and hope I eventually KO them. But that's not really a good plan, because you're trying to counter the deck. You don't want to ignore really good decks. And Giratina is really good and really popular at 10%. More than that if you count Arceus Giratina. So we're going to have to look somewhere differently. And so, as I said, you can look at the engine. And that would be Comfy here and Color's Experiment. There's no way of stopping supporters, really. I mean, there was Shift Tree, but that's a Stage 2. Don't go for Stage 2s when you're trying to counter stuff, because it's a ton of cards. But there's Comfy here, which we use in our own deck. And so I'll look at it on PTCGO, and you can see that if it's in the active spot, it lost zone some stuff, and that's kind of what enables the Mirage Gate, which is the center of the engine here. So you're going to want to stop that if you can, and you can do standard ability lock, but then you can go in with something really interesting here. That would be an Empoleon V. And Empoleon V is really good with this Emperor's Eyes ability, which honestly right now in today's meta, I'd highly recommend you play in your decks as long as you can attack with it. If you can't attack with it, it's probably not worth it, but it turns off non-rule box basic Pokemon abilities, and that's like Comfy, Zigzagoon, Cramorant. It also shuts off some rogue decks, which is something to keep in mind, like, let's see, Lunatone and Solvak. It shuts down that deck, and it shuts down Clefairy, and it also shuts down Miltank, so it's good against those. You're not super concerned about those, but if you have a card like Empoleon, which catches a wide net, that's always good. So now we got the Empoleon's ability, which can stop the opposing Pokemon from attacking because you can shut down their engine. So that's really good, and it's a bit of an interesting solution, and something you probably didn't necessarily expect, especially if you're a newer player looking at this. But it's now very clear that, like, shutting down the Comfies will stop the deck from working, and shutting down the Cramorants is also a really good plan. Keep in mind, though, how they can counteract that. So right here specifically, they have Escape Rope, and Escape Rope is really bad for you because your opponent can just play it, and then your opponent gets out of the active. Now, most decks only play like 2 copies of Escape Rope, and so does this deck, and also plays 2 copies of Boss's Orders, but burning your supporter for the turn just to escape a lock isn't necessarily great. But they have outs, so we're just going to play 2 Empoleons probably, so that we're not worried about Escape Rope. And it's such a big percentage of the meta that it's not too big of a deal. Another thing, now that I think about it, I'll go to the Google document though here and write these down, as we got the Mew tech is Drapion V, and 1 Drapion is almost more than enough. I'll talk about their Mew's counterplay as well in a second. It's not too big of a deal though. You can get around it. And then we're also going to talk about Giratina. And that counter to that would be the Empoleon V. So now we got that. One thing to keep in mind with the Palkia here, though, it actually is able to one-shot you pretty easily, and then it's going to have an even prize trade, and then you're going to be kind of stranded. So you can go after some of their other Pokemon. You can go after their Manaphy with something like Kramer and Sableye, and then you can just go in and KO a bunch of their bench Pokemon with Radiant Greninja. That's an option. So you have some ways of dealing with the rest of their Pokemon. You could also choose to go in with another Raikou V, and so I'm going to stick that in for now. Drop that Zeraora because it's not able to one-shot them without Choice Belt, and none of our other attackers need Choice Belt. So now it's becomes more clear as you're building the deck that Zeraora's necessity of Choice Belt is going to hold it back from being strong enough in this deck. So we'll add another Raikou. It's something we might cut, though. It's not necessary because we can take out other bits of the engine, but something to consider here. And then we have the other decks. So we have Hisuian Zoroark, and then we also have Arceus and Teleon, or just Arceus. So Hisuian Zoroark is really interesting. I'm going to take a quick look at some of the lists here. I can't see that list, but you want to take a look at different lists. But I was wondering if they played Dunsparce, and they don't. So a really good tech for this matchup is just going to be, I'm just going to call them the colorless decks. Aerocard Zoroark. And a good tech here is Galarian Zapdos. This is good, Galarian Zapdos V specifically. That's because you see the fighting weakness. This is one of those decks you can just hit for weakness, and it's fine. So we got the Galarian Zapdos here. This is really good. It attacks for less if they have Pokemon V in play. You might want some fighting energy thrown in there now, but it's not too big of a deal. So we go in with the Galarian Zapdos, and then we are able to KO the Hisuian Zoroark V-Star relatively easily, and hopefully clean up some of the rest of the stuff. And now we're going to look at Arceus and Teleon here. And I think this plays Dunsparce. So there's a few ways of dealing this. So obviously you have the Arceus V-Star, hit it for weakness, but we can't do that because Dunsparce has says colorless Pokemon have no weakness, and that's bad. So what I'm going to do here is look at other ways we can counter them. So we could go after their engine, but as we said, in Teleon engine, lots of pieces to stop. We could now go after their play style, which is a bit of an interesting way of looking at it. And so after Arceus attacks, it does 6 energy in play, assuming they accelerate all the energy, which they will probably because they want energy in play. And so is there any way of capitalizing on that? And yes, there is. Sometimes it's hard to know what to look at to capitalize on. But in this case, it's not too bad because you can look at other decks and see Starmie V popping up. And this is a counter to Arceus. Honestly, it's probably fine to leave out the Starmie. It is 2 water energy, and as I said, attaching 2 of the same type of energy is brutal. With the Mirage Gate, because you need the energy in hand, and searching stuff out perfectly is kind of awkward with this deck. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend playing the Starmie there as well. Zapdos is fine. You can get rid of their Dunsparce by going after it with Sableye, or going after it with Radiant Greninja if they don't have their Manaphy in play. And some of their lists may look a bit different as well, I predict. This list looks pretty similar. Keep in mind, though, they may play Empoleon V. Empoleon V is really scary for you. So we're going to talk about that. As I said, you need to make sure your deck has counters to stuff. So in pulling on V, assuming your opponent only plays one, you're going to want Escape Rope to counter that. And that's pretty easy to do because you can just play Escape Rope. It's really good for your engine pieces. So I'd honestly recommend, I will keep this current switch counts the same. I'll take a look here so you can see all the trainers. We got all your basic Pokemon search, and all your Pokemon are basic, so that's good. You got with the battle via P-Pass and Quick Ball, you got Pokemon Recovery and Thornton and Ordinary Rod, as well as Energy Recovery here. You got a Training Court. Keep in mind, and pulling on V can be shut off by Path to the Peak. So you're going to want to think about how to deal with that. So you can add more Training Courts. Personally, I'd rather drop the Lost Vacuum and play a Training Court, but honestly, I'll probably just keep it the same. Don't want to mess with it too much. We need to cut a card here, though, and I'm going to cut this Raikou because, one, I don't have it, so you won't have all the cards probably for your counter box deck, but you can just roll with what you have most of the time. I'd like to pick up the Drapion V, though. You want to get the best cards for your deck, generally. But there's one thing. Make sure you fix up your energy here. So 14 energy seems good. Capture energy is fine. So we're going to look at 12 basic energy here. And so what types? We have a lot of water types. And then we have fighting and lightning. We only need like one fighting, one lightning. And we also have psychic. So first of all, let's think about, do we want the Cramorants and the Sableyes here? And I think the answer is yes. They're good attackers, useful for countering Manaphy and Dunsparce. So playing those is good. So let's see what we need to cut here, though. We probably only need 2 psychic energy. We definitely don't need grass energy. Let's go over to the energy tab. And we need, let's see, lightning and fighting. So probably only 2 energy. That should be all you need, because you have access to it with Training Core, Ordinary Rod, and Mirage Gate. So it's not too hard to get. And then we also have, let's see, so we have fighting energy. I cannot spell, but we got fighting energy here. And so I'll add in 2 caps of that, and we have a few extras. I could go with 3 of each. I don't think that really makes sense, though. I'm just going to add in a bunch of water. And now, see, are certain attackers more important than others? I think 5 water could be good. And now we could add in the 4th energy. We don't need any others, though, so I'll just stick in a capture energy. And now this list is pretty good to go. Obviously, make sure you pick up all the cards, and you can start testing it on the ladder. And on the ladder, you'll find that you're going to hit games that some weird stuff. It's not the same as the normal meta. It depends on your ELO ranking, which is how, I guess, good you are as a player, and it will fluctuate and won't accurately reflect an actual meta. So that's something to keep in mind. But you want to be able to adapt to that. So I'm going to play this deck, and I'll change it at some point to make sure I have the right cards for the right decks. Oh, and I want to talk about Mew VMAX, the text for that. Yeah, and it's the Lost City. So their idea is that after you've KO'd one of their Mews with Drapion, they'll KO you back, which is fair, but still a positive prize trade for you, so not too bad. But then they're going to Lost Zone your attacker with Lost City when they attack, and they can essentially guarantee that because they play the stadium on their turn. Now, they won't always be able to do this, so it's not too big of a deal, and honestly, if they do it, you're still probably fine because you can probably clean up whatever else you need to with the rest of your attackers. You can go in with Raikou and probably KO a Genesect on the bench, or you can go ahead and Sableye to KO a Meloetta or like an Oricorio or something. It's not too big of a deal, so just clean it up. You'll need to play well. Counterbox decks sometimes are brain dead if you hit the right matchups and have the right build, but it's not always the case. So this is a very solid list, and generally you just want to follow that pattern where you identify the threats on your opponent's side of the board and then figure out how to deal with them best. Let's take a quick look, though, at some of the other top decks. So I'm going to look at Hisuian Gudra here. And this is another deck that is very similar to Giratina V-Star. It doesn't always play the comfy engine, though. So if it doesn't, you're going to be in an awkward spot. But you just want to kind of try to cut it out in the same way you cut out the other decks with the Empoleon V. That won't always work, but it's your best shot you got. And it's not seeing a ton of play. It's like 5%, 5.5%. So you won't be seeing it all the time, and you can kind of take a loss to it. And you can certainly fight it with stuff like, I don't know what you'd use. You'd probably use Zapdos or Raikou. They do get one-shotted. So if you wanted a counter to it, honestly, I'm not sure. There aren't any really easy ways of doing it. Unless you just do some big damage cutting through their damage reduction type deck. But there's not an easy counter to this that I can think of off the top of my head. You could go in with the same strategy as they have, where you go with a healing focus, but generally you'll need to go in with an actual deck with very strong power to beat a deck like this, because there's no free answer. You could go in with energy removal, though. Just play Crushing Hammers, could beat it. Useful in a lot of matchups, but it won't auto-win this, so it's up to you. You could also play... You could probably play like a Yell Grunt or Team Yell Grunt to remove energy. Generally, decks like this, that's the best way to go. Again, no super great way of countering it, but just probably going with Empoleon V there. And then we got Reggie's, another deck where Empoleon V is good, and they play... I was going to say they play Escape Rope, but they don't, which is fine for us. So we can just beat that with Empoleon V. But at this point, you want to hit all these decks with widespread counters, because these decks that see like 2 and 1% play, if you go in with a certain specific card to beat them, you're going to lose. So this is another Lost Zone deck, so you can go in with the Empoleons again. Dialga, Zoroark, and Urshifu are very unique from each other. This deck here is a bit of an awkward deck. Again, we can't cut out the engine, so you can look for some Psychic Pokemon. There aren't any great Psychic counters right now, though, that I can think of. But you can go in with the Drapion V, because they'll have a lot of Rapid Strike Pokemon. You can kind of just chip away at them. It's not something you'll see too often. I believe our deck plays... It does not play Manaphy, so you might want to throw Manaphy in there as a counter and just hit them, and it's probably fine. It plays Cheryl, which is awkward, but it's not too bad of a deck. You could also play Special Energy Denial, but that's not necessarily going to work. Taking a loss from a deck like this without too much play is not too bad. We got Zoroark here, which plays Magnezone, so you can counter Magnezone with... So I want to see if this list does not play Magnezone, though. Some do, some don't. But you can go in with the Galarian Zapdos to KO Magnezone. And you can also just go in probably with Sableye and Cramorant to get early KOs, take the prize lead, stuff like that. And knowing how to navigate these different matchups, it's just nice. So, got that. If you play against any of these decks all the way down here, which you will play against sometimes, you just try to figure out, first of all, identify what their deck is as quickly as possible, and then try to figure out which of your attackers and options are the best option in the certain matchup. Keep in mind, though, you also have boss's orders to clean up and try to get something stuck in the active. That's always an option that you sometimes forget about, so try that. And just play around. This list isn't perfect, and your list won't be either. Honestly, it's really hard to make a perfect list, but you just want to make a list that's good enough, and then you want to play it and tweak it. So I might make a video on tweaking this list. I'm certainly going to make a video where I play this this deck. There are other counters you can use. Oh, sorry, I forgot about the a really important counter that I think works against Hisuian and Gudra. It works well enough in that this deck is almost entirely Pokemon V as attackers. We have that one Cramorant, but that's not too much. And so you can go in with Baby Miltank, which is a wall. So walls are also really important. I'll show you Miltank, which is pretty much immune to Pokemon V. And it's really good. Completely immune, so that's really good against V decks, but there are decks like Giratina, which will hit through you, Palkia, which plays Inteleon, Mew, which has an attack that hits through, Hisuian Zoroark, which plays a single prize Pokemon. So, and Miltank doesn't even auto-win the Gudra matchup because they can just go in with Cramorant. So you need to try to identify stuff as best as possible. You could play Miltank as that counter, though. But overall, this is how you want to build the deck. You want to start with a certain engine. In this case, the Giratina engine. It can really be whatever, though. It's not too big of a deal. You'll try it out and figure out something that works for you. Throw in the drop the old attackers, throw in the new counter stuff. And there you go. And this is honestly advice to build any deck, but I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you try this deck out as well. Give me some advice. I know it's not quite right. I'm sure I'm missing something important. No, I don't think so. I think I went through all the steps because copying from a template pretty much means you get all the stuff you need. But this deck should be very strong, very fun. Counter decks are really cool to play. Comment down below if you have any suggestions for decks. But yeah, I really enjoyed making this. I hope you enjoyed watching it. And I really hope you stick around for the next video.